The Velthary delegation arrived on a Tuesday, which Commander Saris Vane thought was a deeply unimpressive day to begin an occupation. They came in 3 ships, long, silver things that moved through the atmosphere like needles through skin, quiet and precise, and carrying the particular arrogance of a species that had never lost a war. The Velthary were tall, bipedal, like humans, but stretched, 8 feet of pale exoskeleton and compound eyes that caught light in fractured rainbows. They moved in coordinated formations even when they were just walking to a meeting room. Even their breathing was synchronized. Saris watched them from the observation deck and ate a protein bar. She was the only human in the room not standing at attention. She was also the only human in the room who had been specifically requested, by name, by the Velthary High Emissary. Nobody had told her why. Her superior officer, General Hatch, had just handed her the briefing file and said, "Don't embarrass us, Vane," in the tone he used when he already expected embarrassment. She was 5'4". Her left hand had a tremor that 3 doctors had labeled benign essential tremor, and 1 had labeled psychosomatic, and all 4 had agreed would never disqualify her from field service because it was just a tremor, just a shake, just the small constant flutter of fingers that had nothing to do with her aim or her reflexes or the 17 confirmed kills that sat quiet in her service record like stones at the bottom of a river. The tremor was real. Everything else the Velthary had been told about her was not. The High Emissary's name translated loosely to something like Sovereign of Reaching Light, which Saris had been informed was a title of extreme honor, and which she privately called Stretch because he was the tallest of them, and it made her feel better about the next 4 hours of diplomatic theater. He led the delegation into the meeting hall with the unhurried confidence of something that had never needed to hurry. His compound eyes swept the room, cataloged it, dismissed most of it, landed on her, stayed there. "This is the human designated Saris Vane," he said. Not a question. The translator box at his collar rendered his voice in flat, accentless English, which somehow made it worse. The flatness of it, the lack of inflection, like every word had already won its argument before it left his mouth. "That's me," Saris said. General Hatch made a sound beside her. She ignored it. "You are smaller than the files indicated," Stretch said. "Files don't include posture," Saris said. "I slouch." She wasn't slouching. She was standing with her spine straight and her hands loose at her sides, the left one doing its small tremble that she had stopped noticing 14 years ago. She was wearing her standard issue uniform with no decorations. She had been offered decorations. She had declined. The Velthary, she had read in the briefing, wore their achievements on their exoskeletons, chemical markers that other Velthary could read like text. They would have no idea what her plain uniform meant, or didn't mean. That was the first thing. Stretch studied her for another moment with those fractured rainbow eyes, and then he did something that made every human in the room inhale at the same time. He reached into the compartment at his side and produced a data chip, thin, crystalline, Velthary made, and set it on the table between them. "We have reviewed your military record," he said. "We have a proposal." The chip contained the terms of what the Velthary were calling a cooperative arrangement, which was diplomat speak for a structured surrender with better lighting. They wanted 3 things. Access to the jump gate coordinates in the Proxima cluster, a 10-year service commitment from 300 human military personnel to serve in Velthary border conflicts, and a demonstration. The demonstration was the part that made General Hatch's face do something complicated. The Velthary wanted to fight a human. One human. In what they called an assessment bout. Not a battle, they were careful to say, not an execution, just a structured combat evaluation conducted under observation to determine what kind of soldiers humans actually were before they committed to using them. They had done this with every species they'd absorbed into what they called the cooperative. The Rokai had lasted 40 seconds. The Polini hadn't lasted 20. Saris read the terms twice. She ate the last of her protein bar. She folded the wrapper with her shaking left hand, precise as origami, and set it beside the crystalline chip. "Who do you want?" she said. "We have selected," Stretch said, "based on your military records. We want the one with the documented physical limitation." His compound eyes moved to her left hand. "We want to see how your species compensates for weakness." There it was. She had been selected because they thought she was broken. Because some Velthary intelligence analyst had pulled her tremor from her medical file and decided that fighting the damaged human would tell them something useful about human coping mechanisms, about how humans may do, about what humans were like when they were compromised. General Hatch said, "Commander Vane is not," and Saris put her right hand on his arm, light as a leaf, and he stopped. When? She said. 3 days, Stretch said. To give you time to prepare. We are not without courtesy. She nodded. She picked up the data chip and turned it over in her fingers. Her right fingers, she noticed, without having planned it, which meant some part of her was already performing, already feeding them the thing they expected to see. She set it back down. I won't need 3 days, she said. But I'll take them. She spent the first day doing nothing. They were watching. She knew they were watching. The Vel-3 had 3 observation drones in the air above the base that they had disclosed, and almost certainly 2 more they hadn't. She went to the mess hall. She ate. She played cards with Corporal Ewan, who was 22 and didn't know what was happening, and beat her 3 rounds out of 5 with the gleeful aggression of someone who had not yet learned to let commanding officers win. She let her left hand rest on the table where the drones could see it. Trembling. Ordinary. Small. She spent the second day in the training hall, alone, before dawn. There were no windows in the training hall. No drones. She had checked 3 times, twice with equipment, and once by feel, the old way, the way that had kept her alive in 4 different combat zones across 2 decades of service that her plain uniform did not advertise. The room was clean. She worked for 5 hours. What she did in those 5 hours was not something she was going to explain to anyone before the assessment bout, and possibly not after. The tremor in her left hand was real. She had never claimed otherwise, had never tried to hide it, had in fact leaned into it with a precision that most people mistook for resignation. It shook. It had shaken since she was 19, and a pressure mine detonated 6 feet from where she was standing in a corridor on a station orbiting a moon that no longer existed. What most people did not know, what her medical file carefully did not specify, was what she had spent the subsequent 14 years doing with it. You couldn't make a shaking hand stop shaking through willpower. She had tried. 14 months of trying, early on, grinding herself against the tremor like you could wear it smooth. And all she'd gotten was a diagnosis of obsessive compensation patterns from a psychologist who meant well and missed the point entirely. You couldn't stop it. So she had gone the other direction. If the hand was going to move, if it was going to be unpredictable, if it was going to have its own rhythm that existed outside her control, then she was going to learn that rhythm until she knew it better than anything else she knew. Until the tremor was not an interruption of her precision, but a component of it. Until the shake had become so deeply integrated into her technique that removing it would have broken her entirely. Her left hand was her fastest hand. Her left hand was her killing hand. She had told no one. It was not a secret she kept through strategy, not at first. It was a secret she kept because there was no language for what she'd done, no framework in any training manual for how to weaponize a medical condition. And she had grown tired of trying to explain it to people who would hear tremor and think liability, no matter what she said after. So she had stopped saying anything after. She had let the file say what it said. She had let people see what they expected to see. The Vel-3, she thought, were going to be very educational. On the 3rd day, she put on her uniform, plain as always, and walked to the assessment ring they'd constructed in the east courtyard. A circle of marked ground, 50 feet across, observed from 3 elevated platforms where Vel-3 officials sat with recording equipment and what she assumed were very confident predictions. General Hatch stood at the edge of the ring. His face was doing the complicated thing again. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. We could send Marsh. Or Delacroix. Delacroix is ranked. They asked for me, she said. She stepped into the ring. The Vel-3 champion was already there. It was not Stretch. Of course not. Emissaries didn't fight. That would be gauche. But a warrior from what the briefing called the Vel-3 militant caste, 8.5 feet of exoskeleton and compound eyes, and a fighting record the briefing had listed in a table that went on for 2 pages. His name translated to something like first among breaking. Saris called him Chip, privately, because one of his upper carapace plates had a notch in it that looked like someone had taken a bite. Chip looked at her the way you look at something small that has wandered somewhere it doesn't belong. She looked at her left hand. Trembling. Ordinary. Small. She smiled. The signal tone sounded, and Saris' vein moved. The first thing Chip did was nothing. That was strategy, Saris recognized. She had read everything in the briefing about Vel-3 combat methodology, which was extensive and confident and written by someone who had clearly watched a lot of Vel-3 fight and concluded they were methodical, patient, built for endurance over explosion. They opened by watching, by cataloging. Their compound eyes processed motion at a rate that gave them a measurable advantage in reaction time against most species, The briefing had said this with the particular flatness of a fact that was also a warning. She took 3 steps left, then 1 back, just walking, just existing in the space. Her left hand trembled at her side. She watched Chip's compound eyes track the hand, just for a fraction, just for the microsecond flicker of attention that his combat training had probably taught him meant vulnerability, where the body betrays its weakness. Look there first, push there first, that's where things break. She took 2 more steps, relaxed, easy, her right hand loose, her left hand trembling. Chip moved. He was fast. The briefing had said fast, and the briefing had not lied. He covered half the ring in the time it took most people to register that he'd moved, his primary strike arm coming in low-high. The pattern the briefing had called a Velthary opening combination that 70% of opponents had failed to block in recorded assessment bouts, because the low strike drew the eye, and the high strike arrived before the brain finished processing the low one. She wasn't where she'd been. Not because she'd dodged, not the way people thought of dodging, the big reactive lunge away, the panicked scramble. She had moved in a direction that made no immediate tactical sense, a sharp diagonal step that took her inside his arc instead of outside it, which was wrong, which every combat instinct said was wrong, because inside meant closer meant worse, except that inside his arc meant his primary strike arm had already committed and couldn't correct, and she was now standing in the precise location where his reach didn't reach. Her left hand moved. It moved the way it always moved, shaking, unpredictable, not quite tracking the path a controlled hand would take, and it hit the joint at the interior of his elbow with the edge of her palm, exactly where the briefing had marked the Velthary exoskeleton's most significant pressure point in red text, and a footnote that said theoretically exploitable if accessed. She had accessed it. Chip's primary arm dropped. Not broken. She hadn't hit it hard enough for that. Not yet. She was not operating at full capacity yet, but disrupted, the neural cluster at that joint sending confused signals up through his carapace, the arm responding with a half-second of uncoordinated movement that looked from the observation platforms like he had simply lowered it. She was already 3 feet away, her left hand back at her side. Trembling. Ordinary. Small. She heard something from the observation platforms. Not words. Velthary at rest made very little sound, but a quality of silence that had changed. Attention had sharpened. She didn't look up. Chip looked at his arm. Then, he looked at her. She thought, there it is. The moment when an opponent stops seeing what they expected and starts seeing what's actually there. It was her favorite moment. It was the moment everything became honest. He came at her again. Faster this time. And smarter. He led with his secondary arm, which the briefing had described as less powerful, but significantly more agile, and followed it with a sweep of his lower limbs that was clearly designed to remove her from her feet, because a small opponent on the ground was a finished opponent. He was adapting. Immediately. Which the briefing had also noted. Velthary warriors were exceptional adapters. Each engagement a recalibration. They did not make the same mistake twice. She dropped under the secondary arm strike. Not gracefully. She went down hard, practical, her knees on the marked ground. And her left hand came up while she was still going down and caught the underside of his sweeping lower limb at the ankle joint. That same loaded palm strike, same pressure point mapped in the same briefing, and redirected it instead of blocking it, because she weighed 140 pounds and he weighed something the briefing had listed in a unit sheet had to convert, and the math did not favor direct resistance. The redirected sweep carried him forward, past her. His momentum doing exactly what momentum did when you applied it incorrectly in relation to your own center of gravity. He didn't fall. He was too skilled for that. He caught himself, pulled his balance back from the edge, but he had to use 3 full seconds to do it. And in those 3 seconds she had stood back up and crossed the distance between them and hit the same elbow joint again, harder this time, with the heel of her left palm, and this time she felt something give beneath the exoskeleton. Not break. Give. The way a lock gives before it opens. Chip turned to face her. His primary arm was hanging wrong. From the observation platform, she heard Stretch's translator box crackle and then go quiet, like he'd started to say something and stopped it. Saris rolled her left shoulder. The tremor ran up through her wrist, through her forearm, familiar as breathing. She looked at Chip, at this 8.5-foot decorated veteran of border wars she couldn't name who had been sent here to evaluate what humans were like when compromised. And she thought about the station corridor and the pressure mine and the 14 months of trying to make the shaking stop. I'm going to give you a moment, she said. He didn't understand her. The translator boxes were for diplomats, not fighters. But her tone was clear enough. He understood tone. Every species understood tone. He used the moment. He rolled the damaged arm, testing it, his compound eyes doing the rapid micro-movement that the briefing said indicated combat recalculation. He was mapping her now the way he should have mapped her at the beginning, reading her stances, her weight distribution, her reach. She let him. She stood with her left hand shaking at her side, and she let him read everything he could read. What he could not read, because it wasn't visible, because it didn't exist in any file. The tremor was not random. It had taken her 4 years to understand this. 6 to codify it. Another 4 to weaponize it completely. The tremor had a pattern, her own nervous system's pattern, the particular rhythm of the nerve damage from the blast, as unique to her as a fingerprint, and as consistent once you knew how to listen for it. It was not controllable in the way that voluntary movement was controllable, but it was predictable in the way that a heartbeat was predictable, variable at the margins, consistent at the center, and once you knew the center, you could build everything else around it. She had built everything else around it. Her left-hand strikes were accurate not despite the tremor, but because of it. The shake introduced a terminal velocity variation that made the final impact point shift by millimeters in patterns that no opponent could anticipate, because the patterns were not hers, they were her nervous system's. And her nervous system was not something anyone else had access to. Every strike landed somewhere slightly different from where it had aimed. In 14 years of application, that variation had never once landed her palm somewhere that wasn't a pressure point. The tremor found them. Reliably. The way water finds low ground. She had no name for what this was. She had read about proprioception and neurological compensation and somatic adaptation, and none of it quite fit. What she knew was that her left hand knew where the soft places were. What she knew was that it had always known. What she knew was that she had stopped fighting it on a Tuesday morning 14 years ago, in a training room very much like this one, and started listening instead. Chip came at her a third time. He was different now. He came lower, leading with his whole body instead of his strike arm, trying to use mass and momentum rather than reach, which was smart. It denied her the joint access she'd been exploiting, put his most armored surfaces toward her, forced her to deal with the problem of his size in the most direct way possible. It was the right call. It was what she would have done. She went sideways, not backward. The briefing had said Velthary pursuit patterns were optimized for targets that retreated in the direction away from them, which made sense. Most prey ran away. Most warriors fell back under pressure. The whole geometry of their combat system was built around forward back tension. She went sideways and let him pass, and caught the back of his knee with her left hand on the way by, that heel of palm strike again, the same finding the soft places reliability, and this time she put her whole body behind it, all 140 pounds of her, every bit of mass she had, and the joint did not merely give. Chip went down, one knee on the marked ground. The bad arm curled against his side. Both compound eyes turned toward her, and she was standing behind him and slightly to his left, left hand at her side, trembling, and she met those fractured rainbow eyes, and she did not move. Silence from the observation platforms. Real silence. The quality of silence that meant something had changed, and no one had yet decided what the change meant. She waited. She was patient. She had been patient since she was 19 years old, and learned that the body did what the body did, and your only option was to become intimate with it, to know it completely, to stop resisting the parts that couldn't be resisted, and start listening to them instead. She was very, very patient. Chip put his good hand on the ground, pushed himself upright, turned to face her. He looked at her left hand. He looked at her face. He made a sound she didn't have a word for, a low resonance, chest deep, that the translator box didn't attempt to render. Then, he put his good arm across his chest and inclined his head. The way the briefing said Velthary warriors indicated an acknowledgement of something that had no category, something that required a new category. General Hatch, from outside the ring, said nothing. His face had stopped being complicated. It had gone somewhere past complicated into something she didn't have a word for either. From the central observation platform, Stretch descended the steps with the deliberate pace of someone whose conclusions were being revised in real time. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped at the edge of the ring, 4 feet from Saris, and he looked at her for a long time with his compound eyes doing the slow, comprehensive sweep that meant he was reading everything he could read. The tremor, he said, through his translator box. It is not a weakness. She looked at her left hand, still shaking. small and constant and ordinary as breathing. No, she said. It's not. Then, what the file said, I have a tremor, she said. That part's true. Stretch was quiet for a moment. His compound eyes fractured the afternoon light into small rainbows that moved across the marked ground. What are you? He said. She thought about the question. It wasn't the question she'd expected. She'd expected something tactical, something about method or training, or how she'd access joints that the briefing said were theoretically accessible. She'd been prepared for tactical. She had not been prepared for the thing in his voice that the translator box rendered flat, but that she could hear underneath the flatness anyway, the thing that was wonder with all the edges filed off. She picked up her uniform jacket from where she'd set it at the ring's edge and shrugged it on, plain as always, no decorations. A soldier, she said. She walked past him toward the base entrance. She stopped after 3 steps. She turned back. You can have the jump gate coordinates, she said. The service commitment needs renegotiation, and I want the assessment bout clause removed from whatever standard terms you use going forward. She paused. The Rokai deserved better than 40 seconds. She went inside. Behind her, on the marked ground, Chip was watching her go, his damaged arm tucked against his side, his good hand still at his chest in that acknowledgement gesture that had no category. In the courtyard, the light was doing something with the late afternoon, going gold and wide the way it did when the atmosphere was exactly right, painting everything in a color that had no proper name. And Saris walked through it without looking up, her left hand at her side, shaking its small, ordinary shake, carrying everything it had always carried, and would always carry, quiet as stones at the bottom of a river. The renegotiation took 11 days. Saris spent most of it in the mess hall or the training room, which were the 2 places on base where nobody treated her differently yet, because the people in those places either hadn't heard or were choosing not to hear until they had to. Corporal Ewan beat her at cards for more times. She let him win the 5th. The Velthari were not easy to renegotiate with. This was not surprising. They had been winning negotiations for 600 years, which was how long the briefing said the cooperative had existed. And they had developed a particular style of sitting very still and waiting for the other side to run out of willingness the way you waited for a storm to break. Stretch sat across the table from the human delegation every day for 11 days with his compound eyes doing their slow comprehensive sweep, and his translator box rendering everything in that flat, accentless English, and he did not budge on the jump gate coordinates. He budged on the service commitment. He removed the assessment bout clause from the standard terms. Saris had not expected that. She found out about it on day 7, in a side note from the briefing officer, who reported it with the tone of someone who still wasn't sure what had happened in the courtyard and was managing that uncertainty by being very precise about facts. On day 9, General Hatch called her into his office. She sat across from him in the chair that was slightly too short for the desk, which she had always suspected was intentional, and she waited. Hatch was not a bad officer. He was the kind of officer who had learned the system so thoroughly that he sometimes forgot the system was a tool and not a fact of nature, which was a mistake she had watched a lot of good people make, and which she did not hold against him particularly. The Velthari have filed a secondary request, he said, separate from the main negotiation. She waited. They want to send observers, he said, to your training sessions. She sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent light in Hatch's office did something that office fluorescent lights always did, buzzed in a frequency that most people stopped hearing after 10 minutes, and that she had never stopped hearing, and the familiar buzz of it sat under the silence while she thought. What kind of observers? She said. Military caste. 3 of them. They want. He looked at the paper in front of him, which meant he was reading something he found difficult to say with his own words. They want to study your methodology. Their word. Specifically as it relates to what they're calling your primary weapon system. Her left hand. They wanted to observe her left hand. She looked at Hatch. He looked back at her with the expression he'd been wearing since the courtyard, the one that had passed through complicated and out the other side into something that might have been reassessment if he'd had the vocabulary for what he was reassessing. What do you want to do? He said. This was the second thing she hadn't expected. Hatch did not typically ask what she wanted to do. Hatch typically told her what was strategically optimal and expected her to perform it, which was not unfair. She was very good at performing things, but was not the same as being asked. Tell them yes, she said. But I set the terms. Her terms were simple. The observers could watch her train. They could not record it. They could not replicate it. And they would attend one briefing with her before the first session, during which she would tell them 3 things that would be the only explanation she ever gave. Stretch agreed without counteroffer, which told her that the Velthari wanted this more than they had let the negotiation table see. She filed that information in the back of her mind, where she kept things that would matter later. The observers arrived on the morning of day 12. 3 Velthari from the militant caste, shorter than Chip, but not short, exoskeletons marked with the chemical text she couldn't read. They arrived at the training hall at 0600 and stood at the edge of the room in a formation that was probably instinctive, triangulated, covering angles, habits of survival built so deep they operated below conscious thought. She recognized that. She had the same thing. She stood in the center of the room. She let them look at her left hand, because they were going to look at it anyway, and it was better to let them do it openly. They looked. Their compound eyes did the micro-movement of focus processing. She waited until they'd finished. 3 things, she said. Then, we start. They were very still, listening. The first thing, she said. The tremor is real. I am not performing it. I have never performed it. There was a pressure mine on a station called Yevris, 7, and I was 19 years old, and the nerve damage is permanent, and the tremor will not stop until I die. If you are hoping to learn how to replicate this in an undamaged nervous system, leave now. They didn't leave. The second thing. I did not start training this way. I trained against it for 14 months, and it did not work, and then I stopped. What I did after I stopped is not something I can teach in a training session or a series of training sessions, or probably in a lifetime of training sessions, because what I did was spend 13 years learning to listen to something that has no language. I can show you what it looks like. I cannot show you how it works. Those are different things. She let that sit. One of the observers shifted weight. A micro-movement, the kind that meant a recalibration of expectation. She noted it. The third thing. There are no pressure points in my technique. There are no weak joints I exploited through research. In the assessment bout I hit where my hand went. She paused. My hand went where it went because that is where it goes. I have accepted this. I recommend you accept it before you begin watching me, because if you spend the next month looking for the system, you will miss the thing that is actually there. Silence. Then, the observer in the center position, the one with the most chemical text on their exoskeleton, which she assumed indicated seniority, made a sound that was not quite the same sound Chip had made in the courtyard but was related to it. A low resonance. Somewhere between acknowledgement and something that had no translation. We accept your terms. The translator box rendered, flat and accentless and somehow inadequate. She nodded. She walked to the center of the room. She raised her hands, right hand guard position, left hand loose at her side, shaking its small and ordinary shake, and she began. She trained for 2 hours. They watched without recording, as agreed, standing at the room's edge in their triangulated formation with their compound eyes processing everything at whatever speed compound eyes process things. She did not perform for them. She did not modify what she did or slow it down for clarity or explain the components. She trained the way she trained when she was alone, which was not the way a demonstration looked. A demonstration had shape and intention and a visible logic. What she did had no visible logic. It was just her body and the space and the small constant conversation between her nervous system and whatever it was that knew where to go. At the end of 2 hours, she stopped. She dropped her hands. She breathed. The senior observer moved forward, stopped at a respectful distance, looked at her left hand. When you fight, the translator box said, your hand does not shake less. No, it shakes more. She looked at her left hand. It was true. The training had elevated her heart rate, and elevated heart rate made the tremor stronger, and stronger tremor meant more movement in the joint, and more movement in the joint meant more variation in the terminal impact point, and more variation meant a wider range of soft place finding, and yes, she said, it does. The observer was quiet for a moment. Their compound eyes did the slow sweep. Then, you are strongest when you are most stressed. She opened her mouth, closed it. She had never put it that way. She had never put it in those terms because she had never thought about it from outside. She had been inside it for so long that the internal experience was all she had access to, the feeling of it, the listening to it, and no one had ever stood outside it and described what it looked like from there. Strongest when most stressed. She sat with that for a moment that was probably longer than she meant it to be. I suppose I am, she said. The observers came back every morning for 18 days. She trained. They watched. Nobody recorded anything. On the last day, the senior observer brought a data chip, thin, crystalline, Velthari made, and set it on the edge of the room. From the high emissary, the translator box said, separate from the negotiation. She picked it up. It was small and light and warm from the observer's exoskeleton. She turned it over in her right hand. What is it? A name, the observer said. In our language, a name given is a recognition, not a title. A recognition of something true. A pause. We do not give these to non-Velthari. The High Emissary was specific that you should know this. She looked at the chip. She didn't have equipment to read Velthari data chips. She would need a converter, would need to take it to the tech lab, would need to ask someone to translate. She was going to do all of those things later. What does it say? She said. There is no direct translation, the observer said. The closest equivalent in your language would be something like a long pause, the translator box clicking through whatever internal process it used. One who made peace with the river. One who made peace with the river. She thought about the station called Yevris 7. She thought about 14 months of fighting her own hand. She thought about the Tuesday morning she had stopped fighting and started listening instead, which had not felt like a peace at the time, which had felt like surrender until she realized there was a difference, which had taken approximately 4 more years to understand. She closed her fingers around the chip. Tell the High Emissary thank you, she said. He also says, the observer added, that the assessment bout clause has been permanently removed from all standard cooperative terms. For all species. Going forward. A pause. He says you were correct about the Rokai. She looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then, she nodded. The renegotiation finished on day 20. The terms were better than they should have been, which General Hatch reported to her with an expression that had finally settled, not into admiration exactly, which she didn't need, but into a revised understanding, which she did. The jump gate coordinates were shared. A service commitment of 40 personnel, not 300, volunteers only, terms negotiated individually. No assessment bouts. A mutual recognition clause that was new to any cooperative treaty, which the Velthari legal team had apparently added without prompting, which said that both parties recognized that capability could not be determined by medical classification. She read that clause 3 times. She thought. Some Velthari intelligence analyst had pulled her tremor from her medical file and decided she was compromised. The same intelligence system that had selected her to be evaluated had generated a treaty clause that would prevent the same selection from ever being used as a weapon against anyone else. Systems sometimes corrected themselves. On the morning the Velthari ships left, she was on the observation deck again, eating a protein bar. The long silver ships moved through the atmosphere the way they'd arrived, like needles through skin, quiet and precise. And she watched them go until they were gone, and the sky was just sky again. Corporal Ewan appeared at her elbow. What was on the chip, he said. She had told exactly no one about the chip. She looked at him. He shrugged with the brazen casualness of someone who had not yet learned that some information was above his clearance level. A name, she said. A Velthari name? Yes. What's it mean? She looked at her left hand. The bar wrapper she'd been folding, precise as origami, precise as always, folded with the small constant trembling that had been with her since she was 19 years old, and was going to be with her until she wasn't. She looked at it for a moment. At the folding. At the shake. At the paper taking its neat shape anyway, despite, and because of, and through everything. Something about rivers, she said. She finished folding the wrapper. She put it in her pocket. She went back inside. Her left hand shook all the way.